Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm Holly Smith. I coordinate the business and policy programs here at Asia Society Hong Kong Center. Thank you for coming out tonight. We're delighted to have with us Professor Amitav Acharya of the American University in Washington, D.C. He is the Distinguished Professor and the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance at the School of International Service. And he's here to present, to launch his book in Hong Kong, The Once and Future World Order, Why Global Civilization Will Survive the Decline of the West. And I'm sure hope he's right. And we're also delighted to have our distinguished scholar-in-residence, Alejandro Reyes, who's also adjunct professor at the University of Hong Kong, to interview Professor Acharya later. Thank you. And without further ado.
Good evening. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Al, for having me here. This is really the first talk I'm giving in Asia after the book was published on the 8th of April this year. And the one talk I gave on the book was actually in Wellington, New Zealand, just 2 days before the book was published. But it's nice to be here. There's a lot of relevance for Asia in this book. There are actually 2 full chapters in the book, one on China, one on India. But Indian Ocean, Islam are also, and Eurasia are covered. So what I'll do is run you through very briefly, about 15 minutes or so, with the help of some slides, what this book is about. And then I will say a little bit about why I wrote this book. And then we'll have a dialogue with Al and I will have a dialogue. So let's see the main arguments of this book. There are 5. Sorry, this sounds a bit kind of heavy wording, academic, but it's very simple. The first and the main argument, the key argument, is that the world order, and define it very, very broadly, that any arrangement of power, principles, institutions, practices that helps to maintain peace and stability in the world, but it doesn't have to be the whole world. It can be a big part of the world. There is no world order that is truly global, never been. But at least a big part of the world at a given time. And that world order is not the monopoly of any civilization or nation. So here, of course, I'm talking about it's not a monopoly of the West, not a monopoly of the US. And I look at 5,000 plus years of history, going back to the Sumerian civilization. We started in the mid-3rd millennium BC. And from there to the present. I find that what we consider the distribution of power, the institutions, the principles and norms, the approaches of world order have been practiced, invented, sometimes co-invented in multiple civilizations. And it's a shared creation, not a monopoly. And some of the key ideas, I cover a lot of these ideas and institutions, but I don't have time to go through this. But let's look at independence of states that we call today sovereignty, but it's really about having independent states. Diplomacy, peace treaties, free trade, humanitarian values, and much more come to us from multiple civilizations. And so the idea is that the West invented some of these institutions because we have them today is actually a myth. It's not supported by 5,000 years of history. So much of the book is about that. Second, I say some of this non-Western, in fact, pre-Western, because the West is a very modern construct. So pre-Western, maybe pre-17th century onwards, before that, these inventions actually helped the rise of Europe. The West could not have risen and become the dominant force in world politics, or the dominant civilization or dominant bloc, region, whatever you call it, without borrowing these ideas from the non-Western civilization, whether it's China, India, Islam, Africa, or even pre-Columbian Americas. So you're borrowing ideas and innovations from those civilizations, and also extracting resources through imperialism and slavery. So the middle part of the book, there are 3 chapters in the West, 2 on Europe, 1 on United States, that actually looks at this particular, what contributed to the rise of the West, and how the non-Western civilizations actually helped the rise of the West. The third is the global South, is a term that much in the news these days. So let's say broadly non-Western countries. They have not a kind of beneficiary. They're not silent actors in the construction of world order. And this is going now, because the global South is a very a recent term. It's only in 1960s and 70s we have this term. But I'm going back to the time just after World War II, the post-war, post-Second World War world order, which you call the American world order, the liberal international order. In fact, that's not exclusively the American creation or the European American creation. Global South countries were not passively accepting ideas about world order. They were actually actively contributing, reshaping, and in fact challenging and recreating and putting forward more liberal, more open, more progressive ideas. And that's the third part of the book. That includes self-determination, human rights, racial equality, and multilateralism. So the idea that multilateralism was invented by the West or the United States is also a bit of a myth. It's true to some extent, but it's a shared creation. A lot of global South countries were part of it right from the beginning, the World War II and onwards. The fourth argument is probably the most controversial one. And there is a New York Times article I wrote the day the book came out that sort of deals with that. The decline of Western dominance, not Western civilization, the Western dominance, and the end of the US-led world order do not mean the end of world order. Just because the West is declining, the US-led order is ending doesn't mean the world order is disappearing. But it's an opportunity, actually, to bridge the West versus the rest divide and create what I call a more inclusive, what I call a multiplex world. And that's the leads to the fifth point, which is that the future is not what I call unipolar, either led by US or led by China or any other single power, or bipolar, US-China, as some people argue, but all multipolar with a handful of great powers, so US, China, India, European Union, Russia, Japan, calling all the shots. I call that order multiplex. Like a multiplex, maybe one way to think about it is in a multiplex movie theater, where you can see a variety of shows with different directors and different scripts and actors and producers. Or sitting in your home, you can watch Netflix and see you have a choice of producers, actors, and scripts. The world will be becoming a multiplex where no single power or civilization dominates, and where cooperation still happens with or without the United States. In fact, the United States has not been present in several of the major cooperative initiatives that we have today, including the Law of the Sea. The US has not signed, ratified rather, or the International Criminal Code. So if with or without the US, we'll have cooperation, but no single country will dominate every area of cooperation. It will be, again, issue-specific, and it will be at the regional level as well as the global level. So these are the 5 arguments that are fleshed out throughout the book. Let me start you giving an example of the first point. When I say that world order is a shared creation, what does that mean? I have to have some evidence of that. And I don't have time to go into all the areas, but some selectively. But first, this is what I mean by world order: a broad arrangement of power, principles, and mechanisms designed to promote stability. World order must have a purpose. So that's peace and stability. Peace may be too much. Peace means absence of war. Stability doesn't mean absence of war, but relative stability and continuity are a big part of the world at a given period of time. And I also want to remind everybody that there is no truly global world order. The British Empire was not really global. The United States never had a global order, although they came close to having a global order. But most world orders are regional. The Chinese world order, the Indian world order, Islamic world order. There are world orders in Africa, in South America. They were actually regional. And as long as the creators believed that they have universal applicability. And that's what I believe, that most of these world orders in different parts of the world, the creators actually believe that it had universal value. Just like the Americans believe that their world order has universal applicability. Similarly, so did the Islamic Empire, so did the Indians, so did the Chinese. There's a term called Chinese world order that John Fairbank coined, even though it was not really global. It was basically the East Asian tributary system. But the Chinese believe it has universal applicability. So this kind of world order has been always there. It's nothing new. And no world order is free from conflict. Has always been the order that is passing, the liberal order, has also been full of conflict. 98% of the conflicts happen in the global south. That doesn't mean there's no conflict. Only Europe and the United States were spared during the Cold War from actual war and until Ukraine happened. But we cannot expect that a future world order will be totally like a paradise. And also no world order is permanent. World orders rise and fall. So, but who creates and manages the world order? And this is the basic sort of meat substance of the book, talks about some of these examples. So independent state system, which is called anarchic Westphalian system, it's actually in a refined way, maybe different, but the idea that states should have independence and sovereignty goes back to the Sumerians. It was in Greece, it was in Maya civilization, it was in India before Westphalia. Interstate cooperation, diplomacy, and peace treaties originated in the ancient Near East in the mid-second millennium BC. Persia had created the first universal empire with tolerance for all religions and ethnic groups. Joshua principles of India, in ancient India, were actually ahead of the Geneva Conventions. Islamic philosophy helped Europeans to rationalize against the church orthodoxy. Islam actually helped people like the philosophers of Paris and Italy to fight the Catholic Church dominance of the idea that God created the universe and the whole idea of the world operates, not on the basis of natural scientific principles, but by the will of God. Actually, Islam contributed by reviving Greek philosophy and bringing it to the attention of the European philosophers. You can find that in West Africa. The Mandan Charter of Mali, same time came out in Magna Carta, also had ideas about private property rights. Chinese public service exam inspired British, French, and American civil service, meritocratic civil service. You'll find evidence of all this in the book, going through actual documents and the period of that time. The Mongol-Indian Ocean connectivity helped the Europeans to acquire not only knowledge, but also conquer foreign lands. And I particularly focus a little bit, a couple of chapters, one on Africa, one on pre-Columbian Americas, and one when I discuss the United States, I discuss the Native American, indigenous American societies. I think they are neglected in most histories of world order. And I find that looking at them, you find absolutely wonderful advanced ideas about maintaining stability that actually, in some ways, were ahead of the United States. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, actually inspires people like Benjamin Franklin, having a bunch of independent states maintain stability over hundreds of years. And he actually has written about this. And post-colonial nations strengthen multilateralism, human rights, and racial and gender equality. So all of this is narrated in the book in great detail. It's 464 pages. Much of it is about this. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is a treaty that was signed in 1259 BC between Egypt and Hittites, basically. And it's regarded as the first peace treaty, although there are other claimants to this. But the idea of non-intervention, non-use of force, that you should not encroach on each other's land, actually is written in stone, in cuneiform. And you can find that in Istanbul Archaeological Museum. There's a copy there. And very, very similar to the UN principles. And in fact, the UN office in New York has a copy of that. The Prince of Hatti shall not trespass against the land of Egypt. The ruler of Egypt shall not trespass against the land of Hatti. And also there are extradition arrangements that if somebody rebels against Egypt and flees to Hatti, the king of Hatti will grab that person and send it back to Egypt. There are also alliances. If there is a threat against either of them, the other one will come up to help against the aggressor. So again, very graphically similar to the UN principles. This is another very striking example, the Code of Manu from around 1st century AD, and the Geneva Conventions. The protection of not only civilians, but people who have been soldiers, combatants who have surrendered, who are injured, who are afflicted by disease, should be protected. The protections that we actually now give credit, Geneva Convention is credited for, actually were written down very clearly in words in the 1st century AD Code of Manu. And there is a lot more, that you should not use poison in war. So that's the kind of goes down to non-use of chemical weapons in today's conflict. And you can see even the word by word, they're very similar. The idea of freedom of the seas existed in the Indian Ocean for about 1,000 years before the Europeans came in. The Portuguese conquered Malacca. So there is one quotation from the Sultan of Goa, Makassar, who told the Dutch, when the Dutch came to Indonesia today, and say, you cannot trade with each other, the Indonesian Spice Islands cannot trade with each other, or they trade with Malacca or India or China, they have to sell it to us, and we'll be the sort of a monopoly. Sultan of Makassar said, God made land and the sea, the land he divided among men, and the sea he gave in common. It has never been heard that anyone should be forbidden to sell the seas. Now, the Indian Ocean was a mera liberum in practice. Hugo Grotius, the Dutch philosopher and the libertarian who is given credit for this doctrine, was actually on the payroll of the Dutch East India Company. He defended the Dutch attack on a Portuguese ship, which was carrying a lot of booty and items. Passing through Singapore, the Dutch actually seized that ship and sold the goods, basically a piratical raid, sold the goods in Europe, and the Portuguese sued them, and the Dutch hired Grotius, whose brother-in-law was the captain of that warship that sank the Portuguese ship, to create this idea that sea is common to all. But where did he get this idea? The idea that it was already there in the Indian Ocean, that anybody could sail the Indian Ocean. The Europeans created a monopoly. The Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British, then the French, they divided the sea to themselves, among themselves, just like they divided the land. And they made it difficult for European powers, but also the Asians to trade with each other. The intra-Asian trade network was broken up. But in response to that, this is what the local rulers said, that we always had freedom of the seas here. The power of the empires did not extend to the sea. It stopped in the land. Sea was common. And that's a very powerful precursor to the modern freedom of the seas. And you can see that another very interesting thing here is the Indian Ocean trade routes. Now, there was no empire ruling over them. It was not China, nor India. It was all small port city-states. So Malindi to Malacca. So Mombasa, Hormuz, Calicut, Malacca, Palembang. It was basically the open trading system was managed by small port city-states without any intervention by an empire or by the big-time powers, either India or China in that sense. And it was free and it was prosperous because, as the Portuguese writer said, Tomé Pires, whoever is Lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice, because this was the most open, prosperous maritime oceanic trading system in the world. And it was not run by an empire, no great power. It was run by small port city-states. So the idea that freedom of the seas is a Western concept is actually not true, to say the least. So moving on then, I will talk about the rise of the West. I already made this point, that the rise of the West is not because of purely Western European ingenuity, as Niall Ferguson argues in his book Civilization, that Europeans themselves, only themselves, are responsible for the rise of the West. They did not rely on imperialism. They did not rely on prior innovations of other civilizations. That's also not true. I spent a lot of time in the book, in a couple of chapters, to disprove that. How specific European advances were made possible by borrowing from Chinese, Indian, Islamic ideas and institutions, and also resources, extracting resources from the Americas, and also slave trade from Africa. So I call it the magic person, rather the killer apps, as Ferguson would say, that it is the blending of prior non-Western inventions, innovations, with imperialism, slavery, and racism that Europe actually forced ahead. They, of course, had some Europeans, of course, did some things on themselves, but the idea that it was entirely Europe's creation, the rise of the West, is not historically accurate. Now, finally, moving on, the Global South have never been a passive recipient of the post-Second World War order. For example, the UN Charter only talked about sovereign equality of the members. What about racial equality? What about equality of nations large and small? And gender equality. I have also discussed how the idea of gender equality was actually a contribution of Global South participants in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights drafting session. So this is a picture of the Bandung Conference, where racial equality was emphasized alongside sovereign equality of states. So you can also get a lot of evidence of the Global South contributing to the contemporary world order, which we attribute to the United States. So you can read more from this book. But I want to tell you why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I was teaching a course on civilizations and world order to my students at American University about 12 years ago. I couldn't find a good text. In that year, we had 2014, Henry Kissinger had published his book. And I looked at the book, and I thought I'll assign it, and I did. But then you look at it. He starts with Europe. First chapter, second chapter, Europe. And Islam is a world in disorder. There's no order. It's a world in disorder. Then he goes to Asia, and then he goes to another Asian chapter, and it ends up with the United States, acting for all mankind. Now, this is the Eurocentrism, Western centrism I'm talking about. This is like putting the cart before the horse, because obviously the European world order came in the 17th century onwards. The Islamic civilization, China, India, others were much earlier. So this is basically what the students read. I decided to teach and write this book so to set the record straight. So if you look at my book, it starts with Sumer, goes to Greece and Persia, Sumer and Egypt, and the ancient Near Eastern civilization, then goes to Greece and Persia, India, China, Rome, Islam, Mongols and Indian Ocean, the rise of the West, the lost world, Africa, which was interrupted but not ended, Africa's ingenuity and civilization by the rise of the West, Europe's suppression of other civilizations through imperialism, then the United States, and the return of the rest. So basically, I wrote this book because I thought the contemporary textbooks, or even general books like Kissinger, Ferguson, Huntington, Fukuyama, are too Eurocentric, and they simply do not do justice to the story of how this world order was constructed. Finally, ending the West and the rest divide. This is my normative idea. What comes out of this exercise? The idea is not to say that Western civilization is fake or should decline. That's not the idea. It's the Western dominance, the idea of the West as a kind of higher category who created this world order, who maintained the world order, and the world order will collapse when the West declines. That's what I'm challenging. Not the civilization of the West. So the West has been the main beneficiary of the current world order. It's not China, not India, as some Westerners will say. China and India have benefited a lot from Western led world order, but actually the West has benefited even more. But they have not acknowledged the contribution of non-Western societies. It's not there in the policy statements or in the academic books. Having acknowledged that no world order is entirely virtuous, all civilizations have attraction and ugliness, and no civilization and no world order lasts forever, the idea is that end of Western dominance is not only inevitable, actually it's a good thing. It'll help us to make a fresh start, create a more inclusive world. And that is the most controversial idea in this book. This is the world order that will look like. I don't believe that unipolarity is coming back. American dominance or Chinese dominance is going to happen. Multipolarity is only dominant of not one, but a select group of countries. I think that's a bit of a misnomer. There will be always hierarchy of nations, but I think multipolarity doesn't explain the role of ideas and principles, and also the role of non-great powers in international order. So I call it multiplex or global multiplex, where you will have regions, states, transnational actors, and great and rising powers. It's kind of a much more complex, maybe a very messy picture, but still nonetheless is true. So I will end with this slide from my New York Times article, which is called "Order Has Always Been a Shared Endeavor. Many nations of the global south are eager to participate in a world in which there are fewer double standards and more fairness. And a world shaped not just by the US, China, or a handful of great powers, but by a global multiplex of countries would not be a paradise, but then nor has been this one. A fairer world order is possible." So let me just stop here, and I hope I haven't not taken more than what I was supposed to do.
Thank you very much, Amitav, and thank you all for being here. I met you 30 years ago in Tokyo. I don't know if you remember, but I wrote a paper for CSIS in Washington that was presented in Tokyo at the JFIR, the Japan Forum on International Relations. And the title of the paper was simply "The Rise of China." And as I recall, you were I didn't know, but you were the surprise respondent to my paper. Not very memorable paper. And then in the afternoon, you presented a paper on the strategic security side, I think, of China. And then I was the respondent. So we go a long way back, and so it's wonderful to welcome you here to Hong Kong. Can I first, we'll get to questions from the audience, so if you could get ready. If I could just ask you about the multiplex concept. I'm glad that you mentioned like a multiplex cinema, because that's actually what has always come into my mind when you brought this idea. Because when I think of a multiplex cinema, I think of a cinema with many screens, but you actually still have to make a choice of the theater that you go into, right? So at the end of the day, there's still a choice. And so my question is, why, when we sit here today and we think we're also obsessed of the US-China kind of bipolarity, if you will, that why wouldn't we be in a cinema where half of the films are Chinese films, half of the films are American films, and people come into this multiplex world but still have to make a choice? What is different from the bipolarity you're talking about, the multipolarity you're talking about, and what should we understand about this multiplex world that is different?
So, very interesting question. I got this idea of multiplex because you are Canadian, and I also Canadian-American and Indian. And I lived in the street, in Bloor Street, when the world's first multiplex was created.
Right.
And it's sort of always, the place is still there, but it's not a cinema anymore. Now, the idea of a multiplex is you said about choice. Now, that's the important thing. Whose choice is that? Before there was a multiplex, when I was a child in India, you have one movie in one theater. You have to wait until that movie runs its course, no longer makes profit, and you will get a chance to see a second one. Now, in multiplex, you can have the audience. The choice belongs to the audience. Now, that is basically what the idea of multiplex is. That whether it's actually China is not actually a big actor in the world of cinema until recently. It was India. Bollywood is the largest producer of films. Nigeria is actually now the number 3. In fact, there's a review of my book in New York Times, they highlight that, from Sumerian warfare to Nigerian movies. So my argument is that every person living in different parts of the world, their first experience with a cinema is in their native language. My first cinema movie was actually not an English film. I was 20 years old before I saw my first Hollywood film. I saw Bollywood films. So I think that's true of a lot of other parts of the world. So the choice is that of the audience, and they have a choice of different themes, producers, directors. And you can say Hollywood is globally dominant because of creates shapes culture, but that's not true of everybody. As I said, I didn't see a Hollywood film until I was 19 or 20 years old. So the choice of the audience, meaning today the states and people of the world, including governments, but also people, don't have to listen to or abide by or worship or respect only Western values. They have a choice. So yeah, some of them might, depending on where they are from, they can look at Chinese ideas, they can look at Indian ideas, Islamic ideas. And that is never captured in multipolarity. Multipolarity is about power, distribution of military and economic power. And it's a great power club. Many countries are not part of that club. Multipolarity in the European original sense. Unipolarity 1, bipolarity 2, multipolarity 5 or 6. Multiplex is much more shared sort of a notion of ideas and also influence. So that's why I use the term multiplex.
And I'm wondering if you could then deal with the idea that the overarching context that we think about today is that U.S.-China rivalry. Are we making too much of that in terms of trying to understand the world?
I really think so, because I always think the media focuses a lot. I mean, of course, the US and China are the two biggest powers in the world. But there are a lot of things happens in regions, other parts of the world, that have nothing to do with either US or China. So all politics is local, as the former House Speaker, Tip O'Neill, once said. And a lot of my research for the last 30 years as an academic has been to look at the local, the primacy of the local. So without denying that US and China are important, but I think even the influence of US and China is mediated through local realities. And I want to look at how the audience makes a choice, meaning other countries make their choice.
Agency,
really. Yeah.
Right.
So I think US-China rivalry, though very important at the moment, doesn't really explain. And this is, remember, this is a 5,000 years of history. So what is happening in the last 20 years may not be there in the next 20 years. So in the larger scheme of things, longer period of history, you will find that there will be multiple other powers and actors at the global and the regional level that will influence the world order.
Can I then take you into kind of bring it to the ground level? If you're teaching students, I should mention that Amitav right now is, you've been living in Taiwan, affiliated with National Tsinghua University. And you're teaching there.
Sabbatical.
Sabbatical from AU, right? If you have students, young people now coming to you and saying, oh, this is fascinating, this multiplex world you're talking about, what would you then say, well, how do you prepare for it, right? If you're a young person and you're, well, what does it mean for people? What it would mean for, I mean, I'm long in the tooth, and it's all over for me now. But people who are just maybe becoming, going to become business people or professionals, or try to make their way in the world, what do you think it means concretely in some way?
Very bluntly, don't believe everything about the American propaganda or Chinese propaganda. Make up your mind. There's a lot of ideas out there. Islam. I was really fascinated. One of the things that I learned writing this book for the last, say, 10 years, but written part of 4 years. The actual writing was 4 years. I was really impressed by my ignorance, how little I knew about the Islam's contribution, that without Ibn Rushd, Averroes, West would not have come to know about Aristotelian philosophy, because it was the Arabs that translated Aristotle. When his knowledge, books have disappeared. And some of the writings of Aristotle, including metaphysics, survived only in Arabic translation. I did not know that. I did not know that the Inca Empire was actually one of the longest of its time, and it was managed like a federation, not like an empire. There's so many things. That the Mandan Charter of Mali actually had principles of how to treat your slaves, property rights. I did not know that India's Code of Manu, the country I grew up in, actually was almost a word-by-word precursor to the Geneva Convention. I did not know that the Chinese civil service was adopted by the United States, followed the meritocratic civil service by the British first, out of actually here in Guangzhou, when the British East India Company had this office in Guangzhou, in Canton, and they saw how the Chinese conduct a meritocratic examination system. They introduced that to the British East India Company's civil servants. Then the British government adopted it, and the United States adopted it from the Britain. There's so many things we don't know about. So my own ignorance actually impressed me, that I've been 25 years or 20 years as a professor and didn't know about it. And I think my students deserve to know this. So a lot of the book was a voyage of discovery. I did not know that Greeks, considered the founder of democracy, had no concept of civil liberties. The Greek concept of liberty was the liberty of the state. So you basically sacrifice everything for your state, city-state. You don't have individual liberty. If you assert your individual liberty, you'll be like Socrates, forced to drink poison and commit suicide or exiled. So we have given too much credit to the West because of the books and literature we have been given. We have not really been given this alternative knowledge, which is actually true. There is absolutely nothing that is a myth in my book. It's all documented, but it's not put together in the way that Ferguson or Kissinger would do. Kissinger writes a book on world order, best-selling. He doesn't mention slavery once. He doesn't mention racism once. But racism and slavery created this rise of the West. So I was angry most of the time. I want my students, when I was going through, I want my students to know this. And luckily, my American students love it. In fact, they are the big actors in this book. They're given the credit in the introduction, the acknowledgement of the volume. So you get a reaction. These are first-year students, and they never knew about this. And I said, neither did I 5 years ago, by the way. So let's learn it together. So I want my students to read this book, whether it's multiplex or whatever. They get the facts. They go back to the original literature. They can, and it's all, as I said, the huge bibliography there, references. I want them to know this. Then they can make up their mind.
Right. Now, we often call this portion of the evening, this discussion, the fireside chat, but we never really have a fire. So maybe we should talk about call it the set your hair on fire chat. And one of the parts of the arguments in your book that you put up there that might set some people's hair on fire is the idea that the Western-centric, the Western dominance, that it's ending. We're approaching that end. Are we seeing it right now? Is that the film that's showing that we're watching right now? Are we seeing with Trump, with the ambivalence of Europe, the situation in Ukraine, all of these things? Is that what we're seeing? Are we seeing right now in real time playing out that crumbling of that Western order?
So you have to understand what is the idea of the West. It's a very recent idea, okay? 19th century, 20th century idea. There's no West before. Maybe you can say the division of the Roman Empire to Eastern and Western, maybe. But it was a geographic notion before, slightly cultural. But it became a racial notion in the 19th century. West is more advanced. The white people are more not only intellectually superior, physically superior, in every sense. They had a right to colonize the world. Now, but it's only in the 20th century West became a thing. Now what has happened is, when I say West is in decline, is relative, okay? And that's borne out by statistics. A lot of the statistics in my book. So in 2060, by the way, or just before that, non-Western countries will have more than almost 60% of the global GDP. China is now the largest by PPP, but second largest by actual current value of the dollar economy in the world. India is going to be number 5, have overtaken Britain, the former colonial master, could be number 3 in 5 years. So we see the power of the West, physical power, economic power declining. But what is more interesting is the idea of the West is crumbling. Now, and this is always happening, but Trump has actually given it a death blow. So basically, Trump, in one sense, doesn't discriminate between Western allies and non-Western. He has tariffs against everybody. So Canada used to be the largest trading partner of the United States, and Canada is really at the receiving end of American tariffs. Canada is a founding member of NATO, as is, by the way, Denmark, whose territory Trump wants to take. So the idea of the West has become very destabilized by Trump because some of his targets, whether economic or security, Trump doesn't like NATO. So NATO is basically the foundation of the West since World War II. So Trump is destroying the West. I actually think in some ways it was inevitable because the idea of the West, and it's a good thing, because this idea of the West and West versus the rest, which is basically our friend Kishore's idea, in some ways, it reflects a reality, but it's also in a very artificial division. And that has been the basis of class of civilization. If you read Huntington's book, he actually cites Kishore, saying that Kishore talks about West versus the rest, and class of civilization is a bit like the West versus the rest. I actually think, whether that was true or not 25 years ago, it has to go. The book's normative argument is to get rid of this West versus the rest, because non-Western countries have contributed as much to the world order as the West. The idea of the West was based on racial hubris, economic and military power, and imperialism. Now, in the 21st century, we need to, if we can say that actually non-Western countries also contributed to humanitarian values, independent of states, and law, freedom of the seas, there will be mutual respect. So it's not that West invented everything and the non-Western countries are backward and unstable. That's what I tell my students, and that's the big takeaway they get. It's the mutual respect that it's not everything that was invented by the West. West did its part, but so did other civilizations. So when you have the mutual respect, you will get over this idea that the West versus the rest. The West is a superior cultural, racial, intellectual entity, and the rest is basically backwards and traditionalist and irrational entity. So the big underlying normative argument is to get rid of the West versus the rest. We don't want to get rid of the West. I don't really care whether Trump succeeds in dismantling the West. The West will continue as a rump, probably, but I want to get rid of the West versus the rest divide.
Right. Now, I'm going to go questions shortly, but I just have one more question for you. And this might be a bit inside baseball, professor to professor. One of the challenges I've had in teaching a course on globalization at Hong Kong U is indeed trying to find material that's non-Western to provide, I feel that Hong Kong U particularly has a responsibility not just to channel Neil Ferguson or, John Mearsheimer, but also to try to bring to students alternative non-Western views. But in the field of international relations, and you've been really a leader from a non-Western leader in that field, I would agree, it's very hard to find those sort of narratives and the scholarship. When our students write their papers, they'll inevitably, come up with Eikenberry or Mearsheimer or whomever, right? Can this change? How does this change? How do we try to bring to the fore non-Western views on international relations, foreign policy?
Right. So I recognize that many of you may not be in the academic field. I am a professor. by training in my profession, I do international relations as my main subject. But this book is not meant for international relations scholars. It's meant for a general audience. And it's actually meant especially for first-year undergraduate students as my audience because they have not taken a course. We don't really select courses until the second year. So it's more like a course, a book that will be read by the younger generation at the foundational stage. But it does have relevance for international relations. So once you have a book like this, then you will know that some of the ideas, like core ideas of international relations, like globalization, who started globalization? Is it started with the steam engine, as the World Economic Forum will tell us, or it started with the Muslims who invented navigation systems? The first globalization was founded by the Islamic civilization, from connecting Spain, Al-Andalus to Indonesia, and through Indonesia through China. So that's where I start my history of globalization. Where did the independent states, what we call anarchy in international relations, come from? Sumerians and Indian republics, the Chinese warring states, before the Greeks did it. So everything in international relations starts with Greece and Rome. But there are so many of these modern ideas of international relations that have non-Western origins. Humanitarian values, I talk about Geneva Conventions. So that's the idea that students will get access to this idea. Now, none of these are actually totally new. They're all there somewhere in the literature, and I use secondary sources and primary sources, but never been put together as a package. So once you have that, you will have an alternative view. And you can call it non-Western or Western, but I also ultimately want to get rid of the West and non-Western distinction and have a global narrative. That's why this is called global civilization and global IR.
Yeah.
International.
From my perspective, I'm more concerned about the practitioners today who are very narrow in their focus and always take a kind of Western perspective. And frankly, this is even true in some non-Western countries.
Yes.
That diplomats continue to be trained in the kind of Western tradition with the Western thinking. Anyway, enough of me. It's really up to you guys for questions from the audience. Please. Yes, please. And could you identify yourself and your affiliation, please?
Thank you so much. My name is Kira. I'm a PhD student here in Hong Kong with CityU. I'm looking at the impact of nationalism on foreign policy, particularly in the Australia-China relationship, but also on a global scale. And I'm interested to know, in your idea of the multiplex system, how does rising nationalism and populism play out?
Okay, there's nationalism and there's populism. So nationalism is a much broader category, and it has a very positive side to it. Populism, to me, is much more a darker side to it, because populism leads to authoritarianism, as we have seen in the United States today, and also parts of Europe, and also in Asia as well. So nationalism is not again, going back to one of my arguments, where did nationalism come from? Now, we have classic books like Benedict Anderson, who says nationalism is an imagined community. It is something that the non-Western elite, people like Jawaharlal Nehru or Sukarno, learned from from their Western education. And they then applied them to their own context. I challenge that. I respect Ben Anderson a lot. I'm a Southeast Asianist like him, and I, of course, respect him, but I think he got it wrong. Nationalism came not from the print media. Nationalism was always there. And there is a very good book you should read, Pramodaya Anantatoar, This Earth of Mankind, where Minka's mother-in-law berates Minka, the hero, because Minka doesn't want to write an op-ed criticizing the Dutch. He said, look, I never went to a Dutch school. I never went to school, but I feel that what the Dutch are doing in Indonesia is evil, wrong. Now, here is a woman who has never had any education, and she's talking the language of nationalism. Now, how this then becomes a print media European idea coming to Southeast Asia? This is actually in my book. I actually quote Pramodaya's text, translated by Max Len. So I think nationalism has always been there. You can call it whatever you like, because a lot of the words we have in the English language have Greek and Latin roots, like sovereignty and nationalism and nation. But that doesn't mean they were actually invented in Greece and Rome. It's just that there's a linguistic sort of imperialism here, that many of the words we have in English or medieval French came from Latin or Greek. That's why we assume that they were invented in Greece and Rome. Same is nationalism. But nationalism as a mobilizing force, as a consciousness of people, always existed in multiple civilizations. You can find that in Korea, you can find that in India, you can find that in Islam as well. However, I do think that populism, in the way it is defined today, again, nothing very totally new, but it has taken in a character with a combination of the rise of certain leaders at a certain stage of history. And the term populism did not exist until recently. And the way it is happening is that it's a conservative reaction against liberal progressive ideas. And that is very context specific. And I think you can say every society has xenophobia. I mean, you can find that it's not a Western monopoly, like imperialism is not a Western monopoly. But the current populism is a reaction of a declining West. And that applies to the US as much as Europe, to its own decline. So the nationalism becomes a way of denying the decline or challenging the decline. Trump is actually a consequence of American decline because he wants to make America great again. He would not exist in the 1960s and 70s when the United States was actually the leading power in the world. So populism is a response to the decline of the West. That's the way they can fight back. Now, of course, having said that, I do acknowledge that there are a lot of people in the West that are very progressive and still fighting populism. A lot of people in the United States, as well as all parts of the world. So we should not give in to populism. But the current populism is certainly a discourse that is founded on the decline of the Western countries.
Thank you. Another question?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, over there. Yes, please. Thank you. Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, my name is Ahoma. I'm a researcher at HKU. So my question is, your argument's pretext is that even if the current Western hegemon declines, the global order can survive. But with across Asia, the saving rates are going down. And if the US does decline, the global South loses its biggest market. So in such a situation, when economic engines have been progress has been built on economic engines, right? Now that we are entering a recession and West is declining, how would the global South survive without America?
It'll survive very well. I mean, as I said, this is one of the things I'm trying to make. There will be a period of adjustment, but one of the arguments of the multiplex concept is globalization will be increasingly South-South. And the patterns of the trade is changing. After World War II, a lot of the trade was within the North, Canada, US, Australia, US, Europe. Then it became North and South. So a lot of the trade and interdependence was actually North-South. So US and China, or US, maybe some Latin American countries. Now you see increasingly it's South-South. So world trade is, a third of world trade has become a South-South trade, investment. East Asian countries are the largest investors in the world now, overtaking the West. So I see a pattern emerging, what do call it, globalization 3 or 4, is that where South-South links, using the jargon, are actually becoming very important. So the decline of the US will have an impact, but I also don't think what Trump is doing is going to be permanent. A democratic president can reverse a lot of this. And the United States, as you see the newspapers yesterday, Trump is having second thoughts about tariffs on China. Maybe he's being told that you cannot really have 145% tariff on China. It's not going to, it will make even survival of the US as a leading economy difficult. So I think the world will adjust. It's only in the last 30, 40 years that we have really learned to maybe a little over depend on the US. And the biggest distortion of the world is that people took for granted access to the American market. That will be always there. Because the United States did take trade deficits as a public good. and that you can have export more to the U.S., have a deficit, U.S. will take this deficit, it's a public good, in return get legitimacy. That's the best basis of the liberal order. Now, once that Trump basically puts paid to that, I think the world would adjust. Now, in the short term, some countries will gain, some countries will lose, but it's going to be no more different. It's not going to lead to the collapse of the world economy. I personally don't believe that. When there are others who can take over, there'll be more regionalized production networks and regionalized trade patterns. So it's too early to say that what's happening in the US is permanent, and if it is permanent, that will lead to a total collapse of the world economy.
Can I follow up a bit on that? Because I'm going to put my U.S. educated person hat on, right? Are we in a situation, though, where it might be a kind of beware what you wish for because you might actually get it, in the sense that, when I've sat here in Asia, working and growing up in the Philippines, more discriminating, as it were, about U.S. power and the use of American power in the world. But do we need the shining city on the hill? I mean, if I put myself in that position of thinking of the U.S. as that kind of model or paragon that many people, even in this part of the world, think, okay, the U.S. should be, in terms of values, democracy, all of that sort of thing. Do we need that shining city on the hill? And if that shining city on the hill, the light gets snuffed out, won't we miss it? Will there be a problem if that happens, right?
So I think no. The answer is that you don't need a shining city in the hill. I mean, American exceptionalism or the product of a particular kind of discourse, and that discourse is gone. In fact, even Trump himself wants to make America great again, but he doesn't want the rest of the world to follow America. I don't think he's saying that, unlike the liberal internationalists, but that America is the model for the whole world, like acting for all mankind. I don't think Trump is saying everybody should be like America. He just wants to make America great again, for right or wrong regions. So I think not having the United States, having multiple models, multiple leaders, and multiple partners is actually a good thing. That's what the idea of multiplex is about.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yes.
There's a question
and over there.
also. Yeah.
So this gentleman here, and then afterwards, and then.
Well, thank you very much for the.
Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
I'm Esteban. I'm with the Mexican consulate here in Hong Kong. Also a former academic. Thank you for the presentation. Look forward to reading the book. Following from the previous question, I would like to be a bit provocative and say that something that gets my attention, so is the elephant in the room, is not so much that all these elements of world order have existed in different contexts, so that we can make associations and parallels, but rather the challenges they found and the transitions, say the fact that they were superseded. None of the examples that you provided Lisa, in this presentation, right, achieved what its own vision of fulfillment and universality that it envisioned. And in the process of giving way to another period, another order, those periods of transition were fraught with suffering, difficulties, conflict, that then again invited new conceptions of order. So in a way, the other side of the coin, because you provide a very positive one, the sort of shining elements of how we were able to talk about humanitarian elements of even ancient war, or how there was a concept of solidarity here and there, is the fact that it is the incapacity of any single order to sort of provide long-lasting that has created a sort of sequence of conflict that we now associate with our concrete history and the sort of Charter of the United Nations that is addressing a particular world war, right? So then that transition or that series of transitions becomes a history in itself. And I think because this is one of the big challenges that is confronted a concept like this of the multiplex system, is not that, say, in diplomacy, there are notions of diplomacy, conflict prevention that cannot be invoked. The UN is full of them. Is rather the fact that as we stand right now in this moment of tension, none of these elements seem to be just about enough. And that is something I think businesses, governments, civil society is confronting today. I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
So generally, I will be very brief since there are other people here. The article I did for New York Times basically answer your question. I never say the world will be paradise, but the current world order was not paradise either. As I said, the conflicts, 98% of the conflicts happening in the Global South. The Global South took the disproportionate sort of brunt of the conflicts, and it was not fair to. Global South is where the vast majority of people live, not in the West. So it will be a more level playing field. I never say the world would be very stable and peaceful, because no world order is perfectly stable. There will always be, in the transitional period, conflicts and, of course, collapse of some development experiments. But I don't think just because the West is declining, I mean, so in the beginning, I look at how the discourse in the West is today. It's very pessimistic. The world order is collapsing. No world order is there. It's as if the decline of the West equates the collapse of world order. So I'm challenging that. Okay, there will be conflict, but doesn't mean just because the West is collapsing, because there are other actors that can actually provide order at the regional level, at the global level, or in a selective way. So it is that which I'm challenging. So I'm optimistic to the extent of basically saying, you look at the history of world order. World order has never been the monopoly of one civilization or one nation or one group of countries. It has been created in many parts of the world. So there have always been, so in the current world order, you'll find that it will be also regionalized. Some regions will be doing better, other regions will do worse. I mean, we have that even now. I mean, Middle East is full of conflict. Southeast Asia is relatively stable. So I see this as the current discourse as too pessimistic, all because the world order led by the West is collapsing.
Be not afraid. So, there's a gentleman at the back behind you, and then here, and then you. Yeah.
Sorry, I think.
No, that's all right. Please
Yeah,
go ahead and just introduce yourself.
Thank you, Professor Alejandro. Thank you, Professor Amitav. So my name is Martin Searle. I'm the Director of Analysis at Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders office here in Hong Kong, a humanitarian organization. I'm happy to hear humanitarianism has come up several times here, even though it's not a great time to be in the humanitarian sector, government budget cuts being an obvious one. Luckily, my organization doesn't take money from governments. We're insulated from that. But the attacks on international humanitarian law very much do affect us. And I'm interested in connecting that to your argument here, Professor Amitav. Obviously, in our experience and the experience of my colleagues, especially in the field, international humanitarian law has immediate practical impact. Right? Yeah. This is the framework that allows for trust to be built by arms bearers that could prevent you entering. As you mentioned in your presentation, the kind of key tenets of the Geneva Conventions, other parts of IHL exist in lots of different sources around the world. I think the ICRC have done a good job at tracing quite broadly how a lot of IHL values exist amongst these different sources. One of the alarming ideas that's arising at the moment with all the turmoil is that despite that, perhaps this international humanitarian law has nonetheless relied on a Western power backing to be effective. And now we're in a moment when much of that power is no longer backing the institution of international humanitarian law and is even turning on it in some instances and attacking it directly. And so in looking for a sort of snippet of hope from your argument, I'm wondering if you see within your multiplex idea much space for the adoption of, let's say, common conventions. The movies in your multiplex, do they still follow the same conventions of narrative, plot, character? Is there space for all these movies to still adopt some kind of common recognition of something like international humanitarian law?
So, Amitav, if you can answer that, and then afterwards, I'll go to the two gentlemen and together.
Sure.
Right,
so to answer your question briefly, you are absolutely right that international humanitarian principles and resources, especially the resources for humanitarian assistance, has been disproportionately borne by the Western countries. It's statistically proven. So, and one of the op-eds I wrote, not for New York Times, but for another magazine, I said that this is a good time. See, Europe has been the biggest provider of humanitarian assistance in the world, okay, European Union, not United States. United States takes false credit for this. Now, I am asking the fragmentation of the West is actually a wake-up call to the Europeans to actually have partnership with the Global South, to channel some of the, instead of putting all the money to 5% of defense spending, they should be actually building cooperation with the Global South and channeling their significant capacity in humanitarian assistance to the Global South. And the U.S. basically got rid of USAID and who knows what else they will get rid of. But I think the U.S. private sector will remain, I mean, the non-state actors will remain big suppliers of humanitarian aid. The church, United States has, as far as volunteerism concerned, there is no equal to the U.S. I've seen this volunteerism in churches. My son is a Eagle Scout who actually helped 100 families from Afghanistan who are refugees in Washington, and I was with him. And how much people in the U.S. donate for humanitarian causes. So I think if the state funding to humanitarian causes becomes scarce, people will step up. European Union will remain an important actor. I hope they are not going to put all the money into the NATO and defense spending. I think alternative sources will emerge, and maybe it will be more localized. As you probably know, a lot of the humanitarian assistance is local, even though funding comes from outside, but actually the action happens at the local level. So I'm hoping that it will not be a total disaster if we lose the USAID, which was doing a great job until now.
Now, I know there are two gentlemen. Is there anybody else? Okay, we have
questions, yeah.
we have quite a lot. So I can go a little bit
I'm trying to
ahead.
be very brief and
so
not
so if
giving
I
full
can
answers,
collect
but,
three here first, and then we'll collect three, and then we'll collect. So the gentleman there in the brown T-shirt, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Acharya, Dr. Reyes. I'm Sean Kareem. I lead molecular biology at a biotech startup in San Francisco, California, but I'm here because I'm interested in these topics. My question is pretty straightforward. In your historical research into past world orders, what have been the characteristics of world orders that lasted the longest?
Right. And then the gentleman right in front of you here, yeah, please.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I'm Suhas. I'm a retired management consultant and a concerned citizen with what's going on. With the dilution of the dominance of the Western order, do you see greater scope and a possibility of regional blocs which have hitherto not really established themselves as economic and or military blocs? Do you see that burgeoning and growing significantly over the next 10 years or so?
And then maybe one more.
Sure.
Just to, the gentleman there, and then we'll have the lady. Gentleman first. Yes.
My name is Tom. I'm also a retired management consultant. Interesting. I think your main idea is that many ideas from the West is found elsewhere, not just exclusively in the West. But my response is, so what? So what? This brilliant idea exists both East, West, India, China, everywhere. Isn't the more interesting question is, in spite of this parallel development, explain the West leapfrog the rest of the world in the last 300 years. Isn't that more interesting than just enumerate, there's a pyramid in Egypt and a pyramid in Mexico. So what? Okay?
Right. Okay, you've got those three.
All right. So to answer the question, what makes the world order more durable? Is not power, it's legitimacy. If people, not only your own citizens or people, but also your neighbors feel you are legitimate, that what you're doing is universal, is good for not only you, but for all of us. And that's what the United States had up to a point, and now it's losing that. So China, on the other hand, has increasing power, but not legitimacy yet. But when China gets the legitimacy, it will also become a much more influential actor. Now, in terms of regional blocs, there are regional blocs and regional blocs. There are some regional blocs will be like Japan's East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It's exclusionary. Germany's Mittel Europa. So having spheres of influence, or Monroe Doctrine of the United States. Or there is open regionalism, which is a very Asian concept. Open regionalism, that you can have cooperation in the region, but not at the expense of other regions. And I think right now there is some concern about regional blocks coming back in the old sense, spheres of influence. But I think ultimately, and I don't think European Union is a regional exclusionary bloc. It's also interregional as much as intra-regional. ASEAN is actually interregional rather than intra-regional. That sort of development is much more positive, and that's the foundation of diversity and pluralism that we see in the world order. Not sure why Egypt is important, because Egypt gave us the very basic idea of world order. That the world order is a struggle between Maat and Isfet. The idea of evil and good, forces of good and evil. That has been reproduced from Egypt to United States. That we're fighting, the world order is basically a struggle between forces of evil and forces of goodness. The Egyptian pharaoh Narmer, when he defeated, you see the Narmer pellet, it's actually in my book, there's a picture of Narmer pellet. Egypt gave us a lot of ideas about how to build the world order without becoming totally imperial. So did the Sumerians. So the way I use this, you say, so what? Because I learned the idea of world order from Egypt. I learned the idea of Sumer. If that was your question?
The pyramid in Egypt, the pyramid in Mexico.
Sorry?
And the pyramid in Mexico too.
Yeah. Oh, very, very good question. Yeah. There's yeah. Yeah.
So what?
So pyramid in Egypt, pyramid in Borobudur is a pyramid too. In Indonesia, it's basically the Austronesian construct. And I have seen actually the Mexican pyramid, the Teotihuacan. There may be a picture of that in my book. So these actually make a very good point on my book, that world order, sometimes ideas of world order can be through diffusion. So you learn one from another. Sometimes you can do it through independent innovation. So that, like you have pyramids in Egypt, pyramids in Mexico, pyramids in Indonesia, that had nothing to do with each other. Means human beings actually have similar solutions to similar problems. So the Peruvians actually developed cotton cultivation and actually had their idea of zero. So did the Indians, had the idea of zero, and also India was the biggest producer of cotton, but they had no contact with each other. Why? Because human beings create similar solutions to similar problems without necessarily always learning from each other. And ideas of world order, therefore, comes from multiple places without necessarily one teaching the other. There are a lot of diffusion, but there is also a lot of independent innovation. That's the big idea I got from having pyramids from different places. Pyramid is a small example, but the ideas that came from Egyptian civilization, the struggle between forces of good and Maat and Isfet, the two terms. We had them in Persia, we had them in India, we had them in China. I find that this has been a continuous struggle, like the Americans say, evil empire versus we are the forces of good. This discourse permeates through ideas of world order. That's what I'm thinking. So it's, to me, that's a very important example, that the fact that pyramids came in so many different places, or civilizations that are not connected with each other, means that human beings create similar solutions to similar problems.
Or maybe they had an ancient internet. There's one lady there, right? And then if there's anybody, but I think, okay, just this lady will have the final question.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your book with us today. My name is Jocelyn. I work as a legislative assistant at the Legislative Council here in Hong Kong. So my question is, there in IR, there's a scholarship that's called 12 Third World Approaches to International Law. So it critiques a lot of the, for example, colonial legacies of how international law is made. And when we talk about world order, obviously international law plays a big role in that as well. So if you think about, for example, the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, like the definition of refugee is very based on the European context of displacements in the 1940s, 1950s. And when you think about international law, they were made during a time where a lot of the colonial state, a lot of the formerly colonized states were not independent yet. So going forward, if we're to make a world order that is more, let's say, equal and inclusive of the participation of countries around the world, how can we do that? Is there a reform? Is there a need for reform of how international law should be reshaped? For example, the UN as well. When we talk about the P5, it's also, people think of it as a very outdated idea that's based on a historical context. It's no longer as relevant today. So yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts on how we can reshape a world order.
So from a purely legal point of view, international law as a set of very enforceable legal principles It's a very difficult thing because international law, as you know, is not very enforceable. It is basically voluntarily accepted or through precedent, through peer pressure, and sometimes through sanctions. The Security Council can enforce certain laws through sanctions, for example. But I think international law is also very diverse. International law in economics is different from international humanitarian law, for example. I think international economic law, which applies to contracts and investments, that has much more enforceability because the market takes care of it. You won't invest in a country that doesn't abide by those principles. So you can see in Southeast Asia, ASEAN has ASEAN Free Trade Area. Now, it's actually working better than you think because they think unless they have respect for contracts, respect for principles, investors will not come in. But same doesn't apply to humanitarian law, human rights. It can be violated. I think what we need to do is to look at specific sectors. And the one that I worry most about international law is the humanitarian law, really, because that's where we see, because of political change, a lot of authoritarian regimes rising both in the West and non-West. We see a tendency to ignore international law and refugee law being blatantly violated. I mean, you're deporting, even American domestic law is being violated. So what do you do? I mean, I think we need to have vigilance, monitoring. I don't think we can really rely so much on the UN for everything. So at the regional level, sometimes laws are created at the regional level before they are done at the global level. And I see also the civil society vigilance. I think it has to be a collective effort. But I don't think international law can be reformed overnight, especially when it comes to humanitarian and and also refugee law. A lot of laws are being violated. But also remember, just because laws are violated doesn't mean they have no role. I mean, there are traffic regulations are violated, doesn't mean there is no traffic regulation. International norms and law is like that. So they create standards that helps others to judge what is lawful and what is not lawful. And I think that kind of vigilance and that kind of having that law, like the idea of the UN, it's a legitimizing or delegitimizing device, even if when it cannot be enforced.
Thank you, Amitav. Just to close, one aspect of what you talked about that really interests me is, when I previously taught a course called Humanity in Globalization, and the idea of this course is to look at globalization at a community level, at a local level. How does globalization affect people at that level? And I think often we get obsessed when we're talking about international relations with that kind of big picture, globalization, the U.S.-China rivalry, geopolitics, whereas it's very important that maybe we should be teaching, community studies and people to understand more how communities solve the big global problems, and that might be more, the kind of future that we have. But I mean, if we get so worried about the international world order, but sometimes we really, we have sometimes a good kind of order and a more at the lower level, the community level. So.
I agree with you. I mean, the last thought from me is that this pessimism we see about globalization or world order is mostly confined to the West. There's not that much pessimism. It's been actually proven in my book, at least until Trump. Opinion polls, surveys show that countries, people of China, India, far more optimistic about the future than people in United States or Europe. Why? Because the West is going from a very privileged position downhill, and these non-Western countries actually, no matter how much problem they have, they are doing much better than they did 50 years ago. Whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Brazil, whether it's South Africa. So we see a kind of balance of optimism or imbalance of optimism. And I'm trying to capture the optimism of what you call global South or non-West, not the traditional Western countries. But I'm basically also telling the West that instead of bemoaning the decline, which is inevitable, just embrace it and work with the Global South. And there are a lot that can be done. And the Global South is not your enemy. In fact, one of the arguments of the book is the Global South has been a major bridge builder. It's not a disruptor of global order. All the evidence you find in my chapter 13 or so is the Global South has actually worked with the West to create stronger norms rather than challenging it. We have this traditional view, Hadley Bull, revolt against the West. That happened against colonialism. Since then, the Global South has been a bridge builder. And if you look at that role, you will be more optimistic and embrace it rather than say, oh, we'll go back, make America great again. Great, go back to the 1960s? It's not possible.
Right. Now, thank you very much, Amitav. If I could just hand it over back to him. Hello, thank you.
Yes, thank you to Professor Acharya and Professor Reyes for that thought-provoking discussion, and thanks to all of you for coming and for your great questions. The book is available for sale in the back, and I think Professor Acharya has graciously agreed to sign it if you'd like. Thank you.